you, Laura. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm not, I think you might have set the bar a little bit high, but thank you very much. And I'm not going to give much of an, I talk about my pathway a little bit in my remarks, so I think that's probably sufficient. I am faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago, as Laura mentioned, and I have been there for about 21 years at this point. And during that whole time, I have continued to practice as a hospice nurse, which I still do. I said to Lucy and to Paul at the beginning, I sort of apologized for my presentation style. I know these are supposed to be informal discussions, but I am kind of constitutionally incapable of being extemporaneous if I'm talking to more than 2 or 3 people. So please forgive me if if this is a little bit formally presented. I do script myself, so I'm not worried about where my mouth is going to end up once I start. So in many ways, I've been trying to make a connection between social justice and my professional pathway since I became a nurse about 30 years ago. And as I speak to that struggle, I can only do so from the inside out. In her feminist memoir, Remembering the Bone House, Nancy Mears expressed her belief that the not me dwells here within the me. And in that way, we utter each other's stories. So that's kind of my justification and my hope for this personal, or to describe it a little bit more fancily, phenomenological approach, that something of my experience is recognizable to you as well in what I bring this afternoon and evening. So the harshness of the institutionalized care that I experienced in my first professional role within an oncology unit almost exiled me from nursing. And it was the expression of hospitality that I discovered when I learned about hospice in the UK that saved my nursing career and textured the social justice ethic of public health, which has since defined much of what I've tried to do as an educator, practitioner, and occasional writer. So this afternoon, I'd like to try to link together this antiquated practice of hospitality with my fledgling understanding of restorative justice. But to do so, I need to take a few steps back in time, aware of the distortions that come with looking backwards. Next slide, please, Lucy. So long before nursing, my imagination and sense of morality and compassion were kindled by the example of Dorothy Day and her Catholic worker movement. During the Vietnam War, she linked her pacifism with social activism, which took the form of houses of hospitality, open to all, in which strangers were greeted as the embodiment of the sacred, a belief which also propels the Quakers, who strive to recognize that of God in everyone, and among whom I practiced for close to 2 decades. The welcoming of the stranger and the resistance to the needless violence of war became intertwined and embedded in my imagination and conscience, in my understanding of what it means to build a beloved community. Next slide, please. I don't know why I became a nurse in my late 30s, except that it had something to do with an inchoate desire to use my hands to offer comfort in a skilled and tangible way. What I discovered on the oncology unit, with its hectic pace and fluorescent lights, blue biohazard gowns, and thick latex gloves, was that our touch offered scant comfort. Indeed, our interventions often exacerbated distress. We were awash in toxicity, chemical, nuclear, and most sinister, the toxicity of silence, which refused to recognize the inevitability of approaching death and thus rendered true informed consent virtually impossible for the vulnerable patients and their families for whom we cared. The toll was dramatic, from profound somatic reactions to a recoil from the hospital, from all things medical, and very nearly from nursing, which I had practiced for less than 2 years. After my father died on our oncology unit, following aggressive and useless treatment, I thought I was done with it all. But a wise academic advisor cautioned me against brash actions and steered me toward a seminar on nationalized healthcare and hospice, which was being offered in Guildford, England. There, I was introduced to hospice and to a different way of touching that was not predicated on profit and futile treatment. Next slide, please. In England, I accompanied district nurses, sat with a GP who reassured her patients, "Don't worry now, there is nothing sinister here." I visited hospices in which the dying looked out at the hills where they had lived, worked, played, and loved. And sitting near Alice in the garden of the Lewis Carroll Museum in Guildford, I saw a way through that looking glass. Next slide, please. In these hospices, I was exposed to something else which soothed the rawness of the oncology experience. Natural light bathed the atrium and the ceilings were high. Lighted candles floated in the circular reflecting pool to mark the passing of a resident, a stark contrast to the erasure smear on the oncology census board that had indicated a room newly vacant. The pace was slower and the environment indisputably welcoming. Next slide, please. True to their antecedents, these were houses of hospitality, offering refuge to the weary stranger. I was not yet ready to practice as a hospice nurse, but I knew where I was headed. I returned home and shifted my practice from the hospital to the community. Next slide, please. So, fast forward through the aftermath of 9/11 and the gutted primary care and prevention infrastructure, past the horror of the endless wars and the broken children returning home and entering our College of Nursing, ex-medics and disillusioned soldiers in search of adrenaline and a new sense of camaraderie. And during this time, I was volunteering in a maximum security prison in Indiana in a variety of capacities, from Zen Buddhist meditation to gardening, but mostly because it seemed important to be present to the men imprisoned in an archaic institution in a state with active capital punishment. And that led me to wonder where the balance lay between abolition and harm reduction in the form of compassionate presence, and whether even in the most horrific of circumstances, hospitality could be practiced if reciprocity was not deemed contraband. Next slide, please. And all of that laid the foundation for what happened when my College of Nursing entered into a collaboration with Cook County Jail, the biggest single-site jail in the United States, and also one of the largest mental health providers in the country. About a third of the 6,000 or so detained individuals have been diagnosed with a mental illness, and many of them were sent to the facility after the state reduced funding for hospitals and community caseworkers during the economic recession. Next slide, please. So there can be a stillness in the lives of those enduring lengthy confinement, away from the chaos of the turbulent circumstances that often precipitated their conviction. The focus becomes almost necessarily inward. This partly explains why the men in Indiana State Prison were such first-class meditators, why so many turned to writing and other expression of the arts, why prison hospice is such an organic practice. But Cook County Jail was a different sort of animal. And much like my early days in oncology, I felt overwhelmed by the sheer excess of sensation. The overcrowding, the noise, the fluorescent lights, the smell of cheap lunch meat and sweat. The procession of young, manacled men of color being herded through the subterranean tunnels of the jail, the poignancy of the tattooed 20-year-olds worrying about their mothers back home, back in their communities. The blatant racism and classism, our country's unquenchable thirst for vengeance and punishment across the globe and in our own communities. I was there to guide students through the mazes, but I was hard-pressed to offer illumination. And so I sought help from the community, from a place where the mothers of the murdered and incarcerated children found comfort. And in doing so, I was introduced to the philosophy and practice of restorative justice. Next slide, please. The most familiar application of restorative justice is as a legal strategy, an intervention adapted from the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, most famously instituted in South Africa following the collapse of apartheid, but also endorsed in some form by such diverse countries as Guatemala, El Salvador, Yugoslavia, Chile, the Congo, Canada, Australia, and Northern Ireland. The practice calls for an accountability of harms rendered, but also for a listening to the ramifications of harm upon a community. It allows for forgiveness. Next slide, please. But the principles of restorative justice, often referred to as the 5 pillars, make it clear that the applications and ramifications go far beyond the criminal justice system. Radical hospitality, accompaniment, the building of relationships, relentless engagement, sustained learning. These suggest a way to address suffering, an antidote to the long loneliness. Indeed, a way of being in the world, a truth which is recognized by its adherents and practitioners. Next slide, please. It's basically common sense, the kind of lessons our parents and foreparents taught, and this has led some to call it a way of life. When a wrong has been done, it needs to be named and acknowledged. Those who have been harmed need to be able to grieve their losses, to be able to tell their stories, to have their questions answered. That is, to have the harms and the needs caused by the offense addressed. They and we need to have those who have done wrong accept their responsibility and take steps to repair the harm to the extent that it is possible. Next slide, please. So years ago, I became interested in the end-of-life physiological manifestation, which is often labeled as terminal restlessness, agitation, or anxiety. It refers to that constellation of symptoms that often occur in the final 48 to 72 hours of life, and it includes such behaviors as that seemingly uncontrolled thrashing around, trying to climb out of bed, an inability to tolerate lines or tubes or fabric against one's skin. There is an intensity and a mystery to this end-of-life agitation, which frightens and bewilders the loved ones of the dying, stymies providers, and my desire to better understand it stemmed in part from the fact that it was this discomfort that was most difficult to manage at home, and thus most responsible for people being transferred to an inpatient unit in the last few days of their lives. It wasn't pain or respiratory distress. It was this poorly understood expression of the human condition. In a conversation with a chaplain who worked on our freestanding hospice unit, to which people would be transferred from home when their loved ones were no longer able to care for them, she remarked that when patients were able to verbalize the source of their existential distress, it was most often somehow connected with a desire for forgiveness, to extend it or to receive it, or both. We need to be able to grieve our losses, to tell our stories, to have the harms we have caused or sustained acknowledged and addressed. In that way, the principles of restorative justice offer us not just a way to live, but also a way to reach reconciliation in death. The connection goes farther and deeper. The principles of radical hospitality, accompaniment, relentless engagement form a covenant for all mortals. You will not be abandoned, cast off to die in sinister silence in sterile institutional settings. We will accompany you. We will engage with you. And in so doing, we will return to the roots of our practice. We will welcome you in the spirit of hospitality. When you grieve your losses, we will listen and console. Next slide, please. To offer consolation is an act of generosity, and generosity begins in welcome, a hospitality that offers whatever the host has that would meet the needs of the guest. The opening of the doors of one's home signifies the opening of the self to others, including those who may disrupt and demand. To guests who suffer, the host's welcome is an initial promise of consolation. If the cosmic creation of life is the founding act of generosity, the human gift of consolation has at least one analogous quality. No reciprocity is required. What counts is continuing to reopen the door of hospitality, welcoming the guest who needs consolation. Next slide, please. So this excerpt is from a 2004 work by the Canadian sociologist Arthur Frank. Following his earlier and more autobiographical accounts of being a patient with testicular cancer, At the Will of the Body and The Wounded Storyteller, this particular work is more prescriptive and less personal. I assign it to the new nursing students as their first reading, week 1. I want the students to know that what they might encounter in the hospital units is not the only possibility. There are other ways of being in the world, and as Browning counseled, our reach must exceed our grasp. As we move through the semester, we return to this. How can we, as practitioners, as future practitioners, be more generous? How can we make of our practice environment a place of hospitality? I was fortunate to have known such a place of hospitality and consolation. When I began to practice as a hospice nurse, I worked with a small storefront organization. Our quarters were cramped and humble. We provided care for people in their homes, and if it became impossible to keep them there until death, we had a small 10-bed inpatient unit that occupied a floor in a healthcare office building from which we rented space. Our nursing colleagues provided the care, and for years it worked well for all concerned. But we were a good hospice. And with time, our reputation grew, and with it, our success and our census. Soon, the smaller inpatient unit was inadequate. The organization moved from its storefront location into a larger, more corporate headquarters, and we launched a capital campaign to raise enough to build our own unit, a freestanding 16-bed, state-of-the-art pavilion. After a few years, we reached our goal, and the pavilion opened amidst much fanfare and celebration. And it was lovely. It combined much of the best from what I remembered of those hospices that I first encountered in Surrey. Next slide, please. And the next. The next. Those that might need a little bit of explanation. Those were actually, the doors were designed as large enough so that the beds could be wheeled out onto the balconies if the patients, their loved ones, desired. Not all rooms had them, but a number of them did. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. And the next. But like a cautionary fable to carefully consider one's wishes, within a short time, our modest nonprofit organization found the inpatient unit to be more a burden than a blessing. The only way we could sustain it was if the beds were consistently filled with little time for pause in between. Middle managers were pressured by an administration which felt the heat from the board of directors. To keep those beds filled, nurses were pushed to transfer their patients from home. We relaxed our standards of care and criteria, often with serious ethical sequelae. When the financial strain became too much, our modest organization was purchased by a much larger, more corporate-minded hospice organization, which drastically downsized the staff to maintain its operations. Naturally, care and morale suffered, moral distress arose, and nurses and physicians began to leave, replaced by those who sought an opportunity for upward mobility rather than the hospitable care of strangers. That organization maintained operation for almost a decade before it too went under amidst well-publicized reports of misconduct and mismanagement. The organization underwent a hostile takeover by a large national for-profit chain. One of its first acts was to close the pavilion. To the best of my knowledge, it remains vacant today, serving no one. But the need remains. I see it regularly in my weekend practice. Exhausted families in search of respite, frayed caregiving networks just barely holding it together, patients requiring more aggressive symptom management in order to restore some sort of equilibrium that the home caregivers can then maintain. But what happened to the pavilion and others like it remains that cautionary tale. The hospice with which I now practice is a wonderful organization, family-run and steeped in tradition and conviction. They recognize that the continuous care that they are able to provide in-home for patients who qualify through Medicare and Medicaid is inadequate to meet the complex needs, but they are reluctant to assume the financial risk of a freestanding hospice, offering tailored care and hospitality to weary strangers and their loved ones. The most generous hospice is constrained within a capitalistic healthcare environment. Next slide, please. So, where to go from here? The need for increased generosity in more houses of hospitality, our primal need to forgive and be forgiven. Next slide, please. When I was an undergrad English major in the 70s, we reveled in the newly discovered canon of women's writers. The second wave of feminine crested and the anti-war movement crescendoed. In 1982, Reweaving the Web of Life was published, an anthology of writing on feminism and nonviolence, and I thought, that's it. That's the answer. All we need to do is reweave the web of life. And I'm not really sure that my thinking has evolved much since then. I'm not an abolitionist, as I do not want to destroy the prisons of our own making that still hold us and others captive, but we need to construct a new foundation on which to build. Restorative justice offers a different way of being in the world, a reweaving of dysfunctional old patterns. The philosopher and theologian Frederick Buechner bids us listen carefully to our lives. An unforeseen new role within the university, Laura mentioned, has provided me with a new platform, and I take it seriously with equal measures of humility and gratitude. So pragmatically, here is how I am trying to interweave the strands of hospitable care for the dying with restorative justice as a guiding philosophy. Next slide, please. I've persuaded the compassionate director of my hospice organization to allow me to begin exploring alternatives for residential hospice care. In situations where there are not the resources to comfortably care for the dying at home, can we offer a hospitable alternative, a home-like environment staffed by those for whom hospice has become their way of being in the world, a place where the weary can rest? Last week, I traveled to Cleveland, Ohio, to visit one community's response to this conundrum. Next slide, please. Malachi House was founded in 1988 as an effort to preserve human dignity for terminally ill individuals. The inspiration for the house came through a collaboration between Dr. Paul Ritz and St. Malachi Church and the St. Malachi Church parishioners, who often encountered individuals without homes, dying under bridges, in cars, and deserted buildings throughout their city. Father Ritz wished to create a home for the dying poor, where compassionate people would provide care and attention to those who would otherwise spend their final days alone. In 1986, 4 unused row houses located in the inner city of Cleveland were donated to the church. Malachi House now offers a home for up to 15 individuals at the end of their life. The only admission criteria are that they have little to no resources and that they are receiving hospice benefits. Malachi House charges nothing for their hospitality, and collaborating hospice organizations follow the individuals that they refer, providing medications and skilled care. The only business of Malachi House is hospitality. That visit was a first step in exploring what might be a possible model to avoid the risks posed by a pavilion. Next slide, please. Almost simultaneously, next week, on November 11th, we are sponsoring a university-wide educational forum on the foundation and principles of restorative justice. This is very much a grassroots initiative coming from the faculty with some support but no consultation from the administrative hierarchy. We are proposing an endorsement and application of restorative justice, which would shape our curriculum, our relationship with students, faculty, staff, and guide all our partnerships with the community. Thus far, it seems to have generated a fair amount of enthusiasm and support, but one never knows. So I will keep you posted. Next slide, please. If we can embrace the principles of restorative justice as a way of being in the world, we can begin the labor of reweaving. We can circumvent the compulsion to punish through understanding our primal need for forgiveness. Through relentless engagement and accompaniment, we reaffirm the dignity that is our birthright, despite external circumstances, internal flaws, and failed treatment protocols. And if we teach these principles to our children, to our students, share them with our communities, we can shape their vision of what is possible. The moral distress and sense of looking glass distortion I encountered decades ago on the oncology unit were the collateral damage of an institutionalized system driven by profit and efficiency that too often abandons those it cannot cure. To quote Arthur Frank once more, next slide, please. People notice that the system for provisions and care no longer happen in relationships, but now are organized as a system, demoralizes. Being responsible for can provide equitable delivery of services, but gone is the generosity of feeling responsible to. Hosts become providers, and providers are responsible only for the statutory minimum. Basic needs for food, shelter, clothing, warmth, and medical care. Hosts are responsible to their guests. Providers are responsible to their clients, but they are also responsible to funders. Next slide, please. One of the 5 pillars of restorative justice is a commitment to a learning community. If we demonstrate the primacy of relationships through accompaniment and relentless engagement, we come full circle to a radical hospitality that consoles the suffering, eases the long loneliness, and returns to the roots of a timeless practice. Next slide. Thank you. And that's it.